Hey, we're so glad that everybody is here this evening. I hope you're here for the second time, maybe third time for some of you. We've been engaged in a study in this series on the subject of understanding myself. So many people, especially in our society today, are just really hung up on the idea of trying to figure out who they are. And they struggle with that search. And in their efforts to try to answer the questions about who they are and why they are the way they are and what is their purpose in life and so forth, people tend to come up with all kinds of crazy solutions in answering those questions. And in most cases, they're terribly destructive. Somebody, after yesterday evening's lesson, came up to me and said, I just feel like I've been kind of beat up. We were talking about selfishness last night, and they said it in a good-hearted sense. And you're going to feel a little beat up tonight, too. I can assure you of that. But please understand, there's a lot of self-flagellation going on. I beat up myself in studying for lessons like this and then presenting it because, like you, I have spent a major part of my life trying to understand myself. And of course, the Bible has been given to us by God for the purpose of answering that question in the only way that God can. That's why He's given us this book. You've often heard it said that a human being is a very complex piece of machinery, and the Bible is the instruction manual. If you want to know how this piece of machinery is supposed to operate, what its purpose is, how to take care of it, and so forth, read the Bible. Because in this Bible, God gives us all kinds of fascinating information to help us understand ourselves and our purpose in life. The roadmap that we're following in this series is the first three lessons are relatively negative in nature. We're looking at three very common ways in which we get all wrapped up around the axle in trying to understand ourselves, and usually in a self-destructive way. And last night we were talking about selfishness. Tonight we'll be talking about self-pity. In the morning, in the class period, we're going to be talking about self-deception. But the last two lessons in this series, the tone is going to change. It's not enough for me to beat up on you and tell you what's wrong with yourself and myself without giving you a sense of hope that there is a solution to this problem. And that's what the last two lessons in this series are going to be involved with. And that will be at the main worship hour tomorrow morning and then again tomorrow evening. So hopefully by the time you've heard all of these, been able to get a better understanding of who you are. And more importantly, what God wants you to be, and the path to finding that kind of personal healing. I would encourage you this evening to turn to the book of 1 Samuel in your Bibles. We're going to be reading a few verses from 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 6 through 8. This is a little snippet of an incident that occurred in the life of King Saul, the first king of Israel. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 6 through 8. I'm reading from the New King James Version. When Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah with his spear in his hand and all his servants standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it is this day." I want to draw your attention to the statement that Saul makes in verse 8. There's not one of you who is sorry for me. Now, this is the reading of the New King James Version. The English Standard Version, if you're using that, uses a similar phrase. You don't feel sorry for me. Other translations say, you're not concerned about me. You begin to get a sense of what the tone is, what the attitude here is in this statement that Saul makes. It's obvious in this phrase that he uses that Saul is consumed with what we today would call a sense of self-pity. He's feeling sorry for himself. The dictionary defines self-pity as sadness for yourself because you think you have a lot of problems or have suffered a lot. That's from the Cambridge Dictionary, but I want you to notice in that definition the key word. Sadness for yourself because you think you have a lot of problems or suffered a lot. It's what you think about yourself and your situation and your circumstances. It's your perception of life. And that's really the root to understanding this whole problem that we have with self-pity. There's a certain way of looking at life and our place in life in the world that fills us with a sense of sorrow for ourselves. I'm suffering. The world is out to get me. Nobody has it as bad as I have it. If people only understood all the terrible things that are happening to me and how bad this life is for me, then things would be so much better. Because we think these problems are just so horrible for us. Therefore, we expect everybody else to see these problems the same way I see them. And that's why then Saul would make such a statement as this. He's criticizing his own men, his own people, saying, none of you feel sorry for me. And of course, that just feeds his own self-pity, does it not? Nobody understands all the suffering that poor Saul is having to go through. They're not experiencing life the same way that I am. Now, if you're familiar with the story of King Saul, and just right here in this passage, it's pretty obvious the man is talking a little irrationally. He's even criticizing his own son. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But this is really what we're going to see as we delve deeper into this subject in the life of King Saul, is that to be consumed by self-pity is in fact a form of irrationality. It's not clear thinking to go through life constantly feeling sorry for yourself. There's something wrong, there's something broken when a person is just consumed with self-pity, as King Saul was here. And what I'd like for us to do this evening is to dig deeper into this story of King Saul in the book of 1 Samuel and try to analyze what it was about Saul that led him down this path. Why was he so consumed with self-pity? And more importantly, what impact did it have on his life, both as a person, as the king over his people, and how it eventually ended his life? So let's spend a little time talking about the background to this reading that we just read here in chapter 22. We could go all the way back to chapter 13. King Saul has, in prior chapters, been anointed as the first king of Israel. And at first, everything seemed to be pretty good. He was a tall, handsome man, the kind of Hollywood character that struck an imposing figure as a king ought to. And he actually displayed some characteristics of humility during the early stages of his career as king, but fairly quickly things began to go off the rails. In chapter 13, we're told that he was supposed to wait for the prophet Samuel to show up before a certain battle at Gilgal with the Philistines, and the Philistines play a huge role in the story of Saul. They were just a constant thorn in Israel's side during this period of time. Big task on Saul's shoulders was taking care of the Philistine threat. So here's another battle with the Philistines, and Samuel had told him, you wait for me to show up and to offer the proper sacrifices, and then the battle can commence. And Saul waited several days, and Samuel wasn't showing up. And the text tells us after Samuel finally showed up, Saul offered the sacrifice before Samuel showed up. And when Samuel showed up and chastised Saul for offering this sacrifice himself, he was not a priest. He was not qualified. He was not supposed to offer the sacrifice. And when Samuel called him out for that, how did Saul respond? He said, I felt compelled. I had to. The enemy is there. The battle is before me. I cannot wait anymore. I felt compelled and I had to offer this sacrifice. Surely, Samuel, you'll understand. Well, no, Samuel didn't understand. God didn't understand. Saul was just impatient and made a unilateral decision on his own that as the king, he had the prerogative to do this. He did it, and he got criticized for it, as he should have. In chapter 14, again, another battle with the Philistines. Battle rages all day long. His men are getting tired, but the battle is not completely won yet, and Saul issues an edict among his army that nobody will eat or drink until I have defeated my enemies. Now that's key. He makes a statement there that this is a personal matter to Saul. Nobody eats until I have defeated my enemies. It's a personal thing. He wants vengeance on his enemies, the Philistines, and nobody's going to have a bite to eat to sustain their health until he finishes that job. But again, it's personal. It's about me. In chapter 15, God gives, through the prophet Samuel, another task, and that is to take care of the Amalekites. They've been another source of irritation to the Israelites. God says it's time that they get taken out. And so this is the instruction to Saul, is you wipe out the Amalekites. You take the army of Israel and you just kill them. Every man, woman, and child, their animals. You take no loot, everything. Just destroy them utterly. So Saul does that. He takes his army, attacks the Amalekites. He smites them hip and thigh. He destroys all the Amalekites and all of their possessions, except he saves the king of the Amalekites as sort of a personal war trophy. You know, kings did that a lot back then. And he allowed the people to save the best of the flocks to offer sacrifice to God. Now, God didn't ask for that sacrifice. They just took it upon themselves with Saul's blessing to do that. And when Saul was returning from this great victory, Samuel confronted him. Why didn't you do what the Lord commanded you to do? And Saul said, oh, well, I did do it. I slew all the Amalekites. Well, I saved the king and a few of the animals. But other than that, I fulfilled the word of the Lord. And then Samuel said, what is this bleating of the sheep that I hear? Because you've disobeyed the Lord will take your kingdom away from you. You know, and preachers, you've heard, I'm sure, preachers make this statement before on the basis of that. It's one thing to obey God because you want to serve and honor God. It's another thing to obey God because what God wants you to do just happens to align with what you want to do. And that's what Saul did on this occasion. He wasn't honoring God. He wasn't obeying God. He was just doing what he wanted to do to make himself look good before the people. And in fact, on that occasion, when Samuel said, you're done, you're finished, he publicly rebuked King Saul before the people. And it's very interesting, Saul, when he got chastised like that on that occasion, he fessed up. He confessed to say, I have sinned, I'm sorry. But notice what he adds to that. Honor me now before the elders and before Israel. Yes, he was sorry he got caught, but the more important concern that he had was how it impacted his PR image before the people. Samuel, you need to come with me before the elders and before the people and honor me now before them. And this will restore my good image before the people. That's the most important consideration that he has here. There's no genuine sorrow or remorse for having disobeyed God or dishonored God. And then in chapter 16, David comes upon the scene. So he's uttered the foolish curse in chapter 14. In chapter 15, the war of the Amalekites, where he's all concerned about himself and his image. And then in chapter 16, David comes along. Chapter 17 is where David defeats the Goliath, the Philistine champion, in battle, wins a great victory over the Philistines there. And Saul is so impressed with this young man that he drafts him into his army. In the early verses of chapter 18, and then David quickly rises up through the ranks, becomes a commander in Saul's army, and David goes out and just wins phenomenal battles against the Philistines. In fact, so much so that in verse 7 of chapter 18, you might want to turn there and look at this, some of these details. In verse 7 of chapter 18, we're told that when David would come back from his battles against the Philistines, that the people would cry out, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s. David was getting more acclaim than King Saul was. And what is interesting is how Saul responded to that. Now stop and just think for a moment. The Philistines have just been a constant irritation to Israel, a constant threat to them. Saul has been fighting them for years. David comes along, and he's just mopping up the Philistines. Now, what would most rational leaders, kings, think of a situation like that? Well, this man is doing me a favor. I'm glad I have this man on my side. He's doing the Lord's work for me. That's not what Saul saw in all of this. Look through this chapter 18, and notice some of the responses of Saul. In verse 8, we're told that when Saul heard the chants of the people, that Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, Saul was very angry that David was getting all this acclaim from the people. In verse 9, we're told that Saul eyed David from that day forward. One translation says that he kept a jealous eye on David. You see the seeds of envy, jealousy beginning to grow in Saul's heart. He's just seething that this young upstart is getting all the attention and all the acclaim, and he's not. And then, in several places in this chapter, verse 12, verse 15, and then again in verse 29, we're told that Saul was afraid of David. He actually feared David. Now understand, David had not lifted a finger against Saul. Everything that David did as a young soldier in Saul's army was for the purpose of helping Saul win his battles against their mortal enemies. And he was doing an excellent job of that. David, to this point, had made absolutely no move against Saul himself. There was nothing in David's behavior to indicate that he posed any kind of threat to Saul. But Saul saw a threat. He saw in the exploits of young David a threat to his own personal security, to his place as the king of God's people. And so, from this point forward, of course, we see Saul's efforts to eliminate David. David became, in Saul's eyes, an enemy that had to be destroyed. How do you explain all that? Why was Saul so bitter, so angry, so afraid of David, acting so irrationally about a young man who was doing nothing but good for him? I think we can boil it down to one word: self-centeredness. Everything that we see in Saul's career after those early years, we see a growing sense of self-importance, of self-centeredness. We can tie, in other words, what we're studying about now to our lesson last night: selfishness. Everything in Saul's life, in his career, in his role as king, it was all about himself. There's one place in this story that talks about Saul setting up a monument to himself as the leader of his people. So what's the point here? How we deal with the problems in our life has an awful lot to do with how we see ourselves. Self-pity is simply an outgrowth of selfishness. When somebody is always feeling sorry for themselves, always bemoaning the bad luck that comes their way, always talking about this long list of all the terrible things that are cropping up in their life and how life is mistreating them and so forth and so on, The story of Saul tells us, dig a little deeper and you'll find this person has a problem with selfishness. We often make the statement, in fact, for a long time I used to say this, that somebody who is dealing with self-pity, that they struggle from low self-esteem. They have a hard time feeling good about themselves, and that's why they're always complaining, and they see the world is out to get them and so forth. They have a self-esteem problem, very low self-esteem. I'd like to challenge that. When people feel sorry for themselves and are always bemoaning their lot in life, it's not because they have low self-esteem. In fact, it's because they have too high esteem of themselves. Now think about it. Every time something bad happens in their life, it's always, the world is out to get them. Other people are out to get them. Life is out to get them. And things just aren't going the way I think they ought to go. What's the root problem there? I have this vision of how I think the world ought to be, and if the world doesn't measure up, then I have the right to complain. That's not low self-esteem, folks. I'm thinking too highly of myself. I've put myself up at the top in my mind, and when the rest of the world doesn't measure up to my expectation, then everybody else, the whole world around me, they're at fault, and I'm the victim here. No, it's not a low self-esteem problem. It's the exact opposite. And that's what we all need to stop and think about when we get in a position where life gets hard and we start slipping into the mode, like King Saul, of feeling sorry for ourselves. Watch it. Because what you're doing is falling into the same pattern that King Saul fell into. You're beginning to think too much about yourself. That's just selfishness at work. It's another avenue, another door by which Satan can get into your life and plant that seed that ultimately is going to destroy you and the people around you. So what I'd like to do for the remainder of our time this evening is stay with the story of King Saul, and I'd like to see how the story of Saul reveals 5 ways in which self-pity can harm us. The first consideration is that self-pity blinds us to the good that is in our lives. Look again in chapter 22 of 1 Samuel, and notice in verse 14, Saul is talking to Ahimelech, one of the priests, and he's looking for David. And he's confronting Ahimelech the priest. Where's David? Tell me where he's at. And Ahimelech is protesting, says, Saul, get a grip here. And notice what he says in verse 14. Who among all your servants is as faithful as David? Ahimelech the priest just doesn't get it. Why is Saul so bent out of shape over this young man who's doing just a sterling job as a military commander? Saul's reign is benefiting from what David is doing, and Ahimelech just doesn't understand why Saul is so consumed with hatred for David. Well, it's because Saul is full of self-pity. He cannot see the good things that David is doing for him. And folks, that's what self-duty will do to us as well. All the good things that David was doing for Saul, Saul simply could not see. And when we likewise began to, in our own minds, fixate on our problems and the things that are going wrong in our lives, it becomes harder and harder and harder to recognize and appreciate the blessings in our lives. Mark it well. When somebody yields to the temptation to engage in self-pity, to feel sorry for themselves, gratitude and thankfulness will gradually begin to disappear both from their heart and from their lips. A self-pity person is not a grateful person. And friends, that's not a position you want to be in. We have to be grateful. Even in the hard times, even when things aren't going the way that we would prefer that they go, we have to stop and do an audit and recognize, wait a minute, there's still a lot of other things in my life that I ought to be thankful for. And I'm going to focus on those. I'll let the Lord worry about the stuff that's not going right. Saul couldn't see that. And so he was blind to the good things that he did have in his life, in his reign, in his nation. And that's what eventually led to his downfall. A second thing that self-pity does is that it prevents us from doing good to others. Remember, Saul is the king of Israel. And the nation of Israel, from the beginning, well, you know the story. The reason that Saul was king to begin with was because the people went to God and said, we need a king who can go up before us and fight our battles for us because of the Philistine threat in particular. And so God said, okay, I'll give you a king. Gave them Saul. This is job number one for Saul, is to protect his people. Guide his nation through the Philistine threat. And we don't have the time to go through the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. Hopefully you know the story yourself. What did Saul's preoccupation with David do to his job as a king? He was so consumed with getting David, chasing David, eliminated David as a threat, that he was just lost to the threat from the Philistines. And again, we see the Philistines making these raids deep into Israelite territory, taking over portions of the country that Saul, the king, should have been taking care of. He should have been sending his troops after the Philistines, but instead he's sending them after David, a personal enemy. Man who's done nothing to him. Sympathy is wasted when we spend it on ourselves. What we need to do is to lift up our eyes to the suffering around us and get involved in serving other people. Recognize what they are going through, the needs that they have, and to be busy in trying to help and serve them as we have opportunity. Saul never saw that because he was too busy feeling sorry for himself. And his nation very nearly paid a price for it. And then there's a third thing that self-pity will do to us, and that is that it alienates us from the other people in our lives. We've already seen how David obviously has been alienated from Saul because of his jealousy, his envy, his self-pity. But we also see this in his relationship with his son Jonathan. Turn to chapter 20. Look at verse 32. Now this is a confrontation between Jonathan, the son of Saul, and his dad. They're at a banquet. Previously, Jonathan and David are very close friends, much to Saul's consternation. But Jonathan is just not quite convinced yet that Saul really has this level of animosity and hatred toward David that David can see. And so Jonathan tells David, let me go talk to my dad. I'm sure I can get this thing sorted out, smoothed over. And so there's a banquet, and Jonathan is sitting there, and his dad is sitting there, and everybody else is sitting around, and David's place is empty. He, of course, knows better than to show up. And so there's this discussion that takes place between Saul and his son Jonathan. But let's pick up and start reading in verse 32 of chapter 20. Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, his own son, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. You see, Jonathan's a smart young man. He picked up the clue pretty quick. That's all the evidence he needed to know, that his dad had just lost it. But keep reading. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. When you look at the story of Saul, and you see the downward progression that his life takes, one by one, the people who should have been the closest to him began to drift away or either driven away. David, Jonathan, his daughter Michal, so many other of his contemporaries. People just, they recognize there's something about Saul that's going badly off the rails. And people just didn't want to be around him. When we start obsessing over the negatives in our lives, it feeds a sense of victimhood. I'm a victim here. Life is out to get me. And when that starts happening, then we start to look for the perpetrators. We start blaming the people around us. And when we start blaming people around us for things that they had nothing to do with, then they're not going to want to have anything to do with me. And so my relationships are going to start crumbling. Do you see the connection here? Can you connect the dots? Saul's self-pity caused him to push away the people in his life, alienated them to the point that nobody, frankly, wanted to be around him anymore. Well, guess what that does? It further feeds the sense of victimhood. Nobody loves me. Nobody cares for me. You can see Saul just sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into this pit that he has dug. It's a self-reinforcing disease. And that leads us to the fourth thing that self-pity does that we see in the story of Saul, and that is that it breeds paranoia. Getting back to chapter 22, remember in verse 8, talking again to his closest cohort, his men, he said, "All of you have conspired against me. My son has stirred up my servant against me." And then in verse 13, "Why have you conspired against me?" Twice he uses the word, he attributes what's going on here to a conspiracy. We talk about conspiracy theories today as though, it's the tinfoil hat sort of stuff. We're just making things up out of whole cloth. There's not a conspiracy. People aren't out to get us, but we think they are. We've convinced ourselves that everything is stacked up against us. And this is terrible. People are out to get me. The best word to describe it is simply paranoia. In fact, if you read the rest of chapter 22, Saul's paranoia turned into a murderous rage, and he sent his goon squad to massacre 85 priests of the Lord and their families. It was an awful, horrible thing that Saul did. And this is the king of Israel committing this atrocity. Why? Well, here it is. He didn't start out from day one as this kind of murderous tyrant. It took him a while to get to that point, but it all started with the selfishness that we talked about last night, the sense of self-centeredness. The world is all about me, which opened the door to self-pity, feeling sorry for himself, the sense of victimhood, continual victimhood, and finally now he's taking it out on everybody else around him. And then finally, that leads us into the fifth problem, and that is that self-pity will destroy us. It will destroy us. It will lead us down into a dark path from which there is no escape. When you read the rest of the book of 1 Samuel, you see a man who is descending deeper and deeper and deeper into depression, into a form of what we would call mental illness. He became incapable of reasoning clearly. And he finally, in the last chapter of the book, died at his own hand, surrounded by enemies and without a friend in the world. And it didn't have to be that way. King Saul is the ultimate example of what self-pity can do to us. So we need, each one of us, to recognize that self-pity is not a minor character flaw. It's an agent of Satan sent to destroy us. There was a man that served in the Johnson administration in the 1960s. I think he was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and he was the president of the Carnegie Foundation. His name is John Gardner, and he wrote a book called Return to Certainty. And in this book, he made this statement, this observation. He said, and I quote, "Self-pity is easily the most destructive of the non-pharmaceutical narcotics. Like any drug, it is addictive, gives momentary pleasure, and separates the victim from reality." You don't need to shoot something in your veins to fall victim to this kind of irrationality. You're doing it to yourself, in your mind, by how you see yourself, your problems, and the world around you. Now, you may be thinking at this point, "Preacher, you just don't get it. You don't understand. You've never had to walk in my shoes and experience the problems and the heartaches and the disappointments that I've had to experience." And you're right, I haven't. Now, I could respond, "You haven't had to experience the things I've had to experience either." Or that a lot of other people around you have had to experience. See, that's the problem. It's impossible for us to fully understand what other people have experienced and then to try to compare that to the experiences that we have. But if all we're concerned with is ourselves, we're consumed with that sense of personal slight, of victimhood within ourselves, we can't see what other people are going through. But let me lay this before you. There is someone else in history who suffered a lot more than you will ever suffer. This young man was hounded by his enemies. He was betrayed by a close friend. In his greatest hour of need, his best friends, his companions, abandoned him. He was hung out to dry by a corrupt justice system. And he suffered a slow and gruesome death. Talking, of course, about Jesus Christ on the cross. But what did Jesus say, or one of the last words out of his mouth as he hung there? "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Is there any hint of self-pity in that? Was Jesus feeling sorry for himself when he was on the receiving end of far more grief than you and I will ever experience in our lives? No. Why? Because there was no selfishness in his character. Even as these people were taking his life from him, in his heart of hearts, he was praying the Father to forgive them. I know life can be tough. It can be hard. The unfairness, the injustice, the difficulties that we have to experience in this life can be extremely difficult, and it's enough to make us question whether it's worth it. But the Apostle Peter, in his first epistle, and by the way, Peter, as you'll recall, is one of those companions that abandoned Jesus. He knows all about this. He wrote the following, 1 Peter chapter 2. "When you do good and suffer, you have something to feel sorry about. And when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed." When the world treats you cruelly, Jesus says, "Welcome to the club, my friend." Yeah. This life is hard. This life is unfair. Things don't always go the way that we would like them to. And Jesus would say, "I know all about it. But hey, God did not put us here to have a nice, comfortable life. He put us here to," what does Peter say? "Do good. Even if it means we suffer for it. Even if it means that people do not appreciate the good that we're trying to do. Even if people do not accept or appreciate the sacrifices that we make for them. There's no self-pity here. God put you and me here to help and to serve others, to do the good that this world so desperately needs. And we didn't sign up for this in order to get our feelings hurt. We have to learn, we have to train ourselves to do what Jesus did, and that is to commit ourselves to Him who judges righteously. Someday God will balance the books. He'll make it all come out all right in the end. Do you believe that? Then what do you have to feel sorry for? What possible place does self-pity have in your heart, in your life? Let's go to God in prayer. Our Father, we're so very thankful that you have given us this story of someone in the distant past whose own struggles with self-pity teach us such an important lesson about the dangers of falling into this trap that we lay for ourselves. We acknowledge, Father, that the life that we live is not easy, that oftentimes we have to deal with disappointments and pressures and injustices that make us cry out. But help us to have the same spirit, the same attitude that your Son had, that our purpose here on this life is simply to be instruments of good in your hands for the benefit of those around us. That is our objective. That is our purpose. And whatever happens to us in the course of that work, we know that in the end you will make it right. And it's through the name of the one who died for us and did so without a hint of self-pity in his life, Jesus Christ, that we pray. Amen.